Welcome, everybody. My name is Javier Almendarez-Bautista. I'm a priest at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Welcome to Adult Formation as part of our fall series entitled Between the Times, Being God's People in a Fragile World. We're hosting a series of conversations around what it means to live in this time together. So we have had conversations with therapists about dealing with anxiety in the middle of pandemic, explored the world of the Old Testament and the experience of exile through the prophet Jeremiah, the experience of exile through the Psalms. And today I am excited for a conversation which we've titled Faithful Citizenship. Where do we go from here? And with me today is someone you may already know very well, Aleta McClenney, who's been a member of St. Paul's for a while. And I just wanted to let you know a few of her job titles in the recent past that just made me really excited about talking about faithful citizenship with her. So Aleta had a career in journalism and was also the Deputy Executive Director of the Council of Churches, the Executive Director of the Johnson Service Corps in Chapel Hill, and now serves as a Senior Associate Editor for Faith and Leadership. Aleta and I have known each other over the past few years, done a lot of work together here at St. Paul's. And this conversation started really as how do we think about the word citizenship? That was really the prompting sort of idea. And so we hope to just have a conversation between Aleta and I, and we hope that you will join in the conversation. With that, Aleta, citizenship.
Citizenship.
Yeah.
I would love to start if we could with sort of what citizenship means to you, because I know, and I'd love for them to know a little bit about that story for you.
Yeah, the meaning of citizenship. That was the sort of the prompting fact, or the prompting question for me as we thought about this. And the idea of citizenship for me, just to give a little background, many of you know I wasn't born in this country. I was born in El Salvador in the 80s, in the middle of a civil war. And before that, I had an aunt who had married an American citizen, had become a citizen herself. And she started a process for her family, sort of a family reunification process, where she applied for some of her family members to gain access to citizenship in the US. And she did that even before I was born. And it wasn't until I was close to 10 years old that we heard back from the United States Embassy. That was an over 10 or 11-year wait just to hear if we could have an interview. And by that time, the war was over. My family decided to move, partly because it was a great opportunity to move to the United States and make a new life. And so that's the context in which, so 10 years passed. I moved to the States when I was 10. And then it wasn't until I was 20, March 28th, 2007, that I went to a courthouse in Portland and sat in a room full of people from all over the world and said the Pledge of Allegiance and sang God Bless America for the first time as a citizen. And I remember in that day, I remember what I was wearing. I had bought a khaki shirt and some beige pants. I don't know, they clashed kind of. And I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, but I remember very clearly what I was wearing. Remember the patchwork of brown that was my body there that day. And I remember thinking, I don't have to be afraid anymore. And not that I had been conscious of being afraid before, but without that citizenship, my right to be in this country could have been taken away at any time. And it was the place I'd known. I moved here when I was 10. I had had my formative years here by that time. And I just remember that feeling of something that was given and something that I could appreciate in that moment. And that's the image that comes to mind for me when I think about what citizenship means. Sort of like a security and peace that I hadn't I didn't know I was missing. Maybe it wasn't like a conscious thought all the time, but it was, I remember that feeling, you know? So I kind of wonder what does, what comes to mind for you when you think about that word citizenship?
Well, I have to say, hearing you tell that story, when you get to the end of it, I almost breathe a sigh of relief for you. It's like, yeah, okay. So citizenship for me, I go back in part to that I majored in college in government and foreign affairs.
Okay.
And I was at the University of Virginia, and I mentioned that for two reasons. One is because we are still the men's basketball national championship, and there is a limited window of opportunity to say that, and I recognize that. Um, but also, if you can imagine getting a degree in government from the University of Virginia, it's taken pretty seriously there. It is in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson in all things, in all conversations, in all classes. So you know, I came out of college with a strong sort of intellectual academic understanding of citizenship and democracy and all of those things. Um, but it was several years later, and we had actually taken our boys to the Smithsonian. I'm going to guess it was about 20 years ago. And we were in the Museum of, I think it must have been American History, where they have one of the original American flags, um, fragile and behind glass. And they were actually at that point in the process of doing some restoration on it. So you could stand right up against the glass and see this enormous um, fragile cloth that had survived hundreds of years at that point. Um, and with my intellectual academic understanding of democracy, I had this very visceral reaction of um, looking at it and feeling for the first time consciously in my life a sense of ownership. That perhaps there were aspects of being an American that had been distant from me, that had been held away from me, and seeing that flag um, really it resonated with me in a way that all of the classes and all of the instruction and all of the discussion and reading had not. Um,
Mm.
and so yeah, that was it. Still, I still feel that when I think about it, because I remember the boys wanting to be done. They wanted to go on to see something else, and I just stood there, trying to slow the flow of people behind me who would be pushing me along, because I my eyes couldn't leave that flag.
I love the way that image is this tattered, fragile flag.
Mhm.
Um, I kind of sense that sort of fragility of that
Yeah,
enfranchisement in the way that you narrate that, right? Like that it wasn't guaranteed, you
right.
know?
It's held by fragile strand. Yeah, very
Um,
much, very much so.
those yeah, it's not and I love the woven fabric of it too, the imagery of that.
Mhm, mhm.
What does citizenship, so we have these images of like stories that that sort of frame for us what citizenship means to us. Um, and I like the sort of themes that I recognize in both of our stories as to we know what maybe just even self-consciously, maybe just historically, what not being treated like a citizen is, what not being enfranchised is, because of the history of our peoples or our personal history.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious, what does citizenship mean to you now in this?
Um, so a couple of things occur to me, and one comes from someone that you know as a professor and that I know as an author, um, and it's a now Yale theologian named Willie Jennings, and he wrote a really really powerful piece over the summer after George Floyd was murdered, um, and in it he said, "Hope is a discipline; it's not a sentiment."
Mm,
Um,
mhm,
hope is something we work on, something we work toward. It is what we are constantly moving toward, but it is not guaranteed to us, nor is it to be taken lightly, I think. Um, And so holding that vision of what I hope for and what I hope we are working toward, I think the other piece of citizenship for me is I think we love a country and we love our role in that country sort of on a spectrum. And I think there's a way you can love it that is almost what I would call a crush. And that is it's shiny and beautiful and you love the symbols and the externality of it. Um, and I think there's along that line, I am closer to a love that sees the flaws and loves beyond the flaws and that wants to help um, improve. Um, when you're in a relationship um, with a friend or a partner or with your children, if you spend enough time with them, you see them at their best and you see them at places where you're like, oh my gosh. And I think my love right now um, is deep and abiding and not easily taken from me, but it's also with the knowledge that there are things that could be better and that there are ways, there are responsibilities I have to make that relationship better. Um, and that there are changes that I still hope for, I actively work toward um, making better. So um, still with that fragility there, though, still with that,
Hmm.
you know.
I was gonna say, and I love the language of um, well, I think I resonate with the language of discipline,
Yeah.
that it takes a kind of work that I was thinking back to again sort of how I became a citizen, and I think I've told you this before, maybe, but my father and I went to college in Seattle, and
I
so I
love
became
this story. Yeah.
yeah, I I was in college in Seattle. My folks were in Portland, and my father would go pick me up at college, whenever I needed to come home for a break. And it was in my college years that I became a citizen. And this was back in the days of CD and tape decks, which is not that far away, but feels far away.
Yeah.
And we had this study guide for the citizenship test. You have to sort of review and take a test on
Work
some
toward it. Hmm.
American government. And my father and I would listen to the CD
Hmm.
and review on that, 2.5, 3 hour drive between getting home and coming back to school. I don't know. There was something to that space that I love that memory of my father and I learning together, and it was a discipline. It was something we were working toward, and we were sort of learning the ways of a new place and sort of familiarizing ourselves with that. And it took work. Um, um, anyway, that's the image that came to mind for me. um, yeah, and
We shared that story before, and the idea of the two of you and that back and forth and the commitment, the shared commitment. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's and maybe that kind of gets at I think how I think of the experience, the sense of what it means to be a citizen now. I still sort of see it, and I think people at St. Paul's would recognize this because they say every preacher has one sermon that they just say a bunch of different ways. And I think I say this sermon a lot and I recognize it every once in a while, but I see the experience of citizenship through the lens of exile. I love the prophet Jeremiah, talking to the Israelites in exile, saying, seek the welfare of the city to which I've sent you, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And there's the words of a Palestinian poet, Mahmoud Darwish, that are on my mind these days as to what it means to love a place. But the line is something like, in exile, you learn to contemplate and admire what isn't yours. And sort of, I think of the experience of citizenship now for me, like I'm not from here. I have become enfranchised here. and I am away from the place that I called home, but I am in a new place that I am claiming as home. And I am learning to contemplate and admire what isn't mine. And you talked about that sort of like a crush developing into a love. I am learning to sort of approach it that way. And for me, that's a rich experience of the curiosity that comes with learning to love a place, with learning to love a people and a place and a new setting. Um, and I see the words of scripture speaking into that, you're not home. It's okay. There's things to love here. How are you going to love them? What disciplines are you going to take up to learn how to love them? Um, yeah.
Yeah. I that we are have been in Exodus,
Yeah.
in the lectionary has been very powerful the last few weeks, and I hear that in there as well.
Yeah, you're talking about the wilderness experience. It's been, I mean, it's very appropriate for a sort of election season.
It's very appropriate for election season.
That was on the lectionary writers' minds. They weren't thinking about 2020 being this way and in the middle of a pandemic and everything. But we're looking at the narrative of these people that are fleeing captivity and seeking freedom, and they're kind of in between. And
Right.
they're figuring out their way. Um, it's a space that we sort of occupy.
I feel like we have been in the in between for so long. I'm feeling I'm feeling their pain and their fear and their anxiety, and I'm wondering, what do you see? What um, not getting too far ahead of ourselves, but after November 3rd,
Oof. Yeah.
what do you see out of this season?
Mm. Again, we take sort of the broad view and we're talking about some of the images of scripture and being in between. And then you sort of encounter practical reality. And I'm just sort of sitting with that question of the division isn't going to go away on November 3rd, whoever is elected, whichever party holds Congress, whatever way these conversations happen, it's not just going to disappear, you know, at that moment. And so thinking of that immediate future and sort of realizing that the wilderness experience is something that we will keep experiencing um, is not comforting. But I think what I envision past November 3rd, what what I envision for this time before and after November 3rd is the same sort of practices and disciplines that I found life giving now, that the work isn't over. And, I think I was telling somebody about this the other day, but I've been reading a book entitled, it was in my sermon last week, Freedom is an Endless Meeting. It's a quote from and freedom is an endless meeting. I mean, it's so depressing and so beautiful at the same time to sort of think of this member of the Students for a Democratic Society in the 60s sort of reflecting on the experience of trying to participate democratically to make change happen, and reflecting that working through that takes sort of endless meetings and work. Um, but I love the way that phrase can mean a couple of things, right? It can be an endless meeting, like the Zoom meetings we have that don't seem to end, or it can be what I would call an eternal encounter with the other, that you're being invited into a way of life that admires and appreciates what isn't yours, right? So the invitation is just always there. Your freedom isn't complete until you encounter this other person. And that's, I think, the crux, the backbone of the work that I've spent a lot of time on over the past 4 years with One Week. It started with a few clergy getting together and asking the question, Aren't you tired of meeting people when their rent is late and their bills are past due? Wouldn't you rather figure out a way to act before those issues are there in the first place? Wouldn't you rather there be affordable housing for people working hard to get by? Wouldn't you rather there be jobs that pay enough for them to be able to afford to get by so that they're not calling you in the middle of the night because they don't have anywhere else to turn? And they call a priest in Cary saying, I don't have anywhere else to turn. Can you help me pay my light bill? And that was the prompting question for me. I don't care about the partisan politics. I don't want to be invested in that. I want to be invested in solutions that have as their concern the needs of those most affected by the decisions we make as a citizenry, as the people that want to work toward the common good. But it's that for me, the work of listening and gathering and debating and compromising and negotiating for a common purpose, it hasn't been just to 4 years and now we established this organization and now everything's going to be great. No, the work just started. um, and these issues aren't going away. Can we sort of, I like how you brought up disciplines of hope. Can we establish those disciplines so deeply within us that are sort of thinking about what it means to be a responsible, faithful person in this world is invested in that continuous encounter and contemplating and admiring a person that looks so different than you? I I don't know if we can, but I think it's worth aspiring to. You know, um, that's what I think of.
Well, and you hold up, I think, two really important things there, and that is it's messy. It is not the straightest line, and I think um, culturally in this country we sometimes want efficiency,
Right.
and efficiency is not always the best things way to get things done. Um, so there's that, and you also raise, you know, the collaborative nature of it, that you don't go alone. You go more slowly, but you go as a group, and you're more powerful as that group. Um, and that is, I think, something that has been missing. That, I hope can be recovered after November 3rd. Is that sense of we are truly in this together, and we will do better when we do this together.
Yeah.
Um, I talked to you. You're familiar with Johnson Service Corps, which, for those who aren't, is a service year program. It is the local affiliate of the Episcopal Service Corps, and it has houses in Durham and Chapel Hill, young people 21 to 29 who spend a service year with a local nonprofit. But even more importantly, and I think the harder part of that year, is they live in what's called intentional community. And that is, you are more than roommates. You will share a food budget that is contained on one itty bitty debit card that all 8 or 9 people in that house have to make decisions around. You will have shared meals together. You will have house meetings. You will plan events outside of the house together. And it is hard. Um, I will, that is probably the single hardest part of I think, a service year for anyone. Um, but what comes out of that is this spirit of co-creation and of collaboration. And probably the most important through line of that service year is something we call servant leadership. And that is exercising power with rather than power over. And, power with strengthens everybody in that frame. And it makes everything that you accomplish so much more valuable than coming in and saying, this is how we're going to do it because that's the way I've always done it. And, um, so, so,
Mm.
um, it
Yeah.
also, go ahead.
I was just thinking you're talking about some disciplines there, and you know, I don't want to sort of romanticize sort of the situation we're in, where I think we're you know this appeal toward this kind of collaboration and investment in that encounter. Um, I think you did a really good job at pointing to this example of a community where that is such challenging work for young adults to do for a year, not to mention for older folks or folks going about their daily lives trying to do it, you know,
Right.
in practice without sharing a food budget, without needing to run into each other. Honestly, that takes again, it's called intentional community for a reason.
Called
I'm
it.
kind of curious, we've been talking about disciplines and practices. Are there practices that you think would be needed, something that we need in order to sort of live into that past November 3rd?
Um, so yeah, I think there are some very practical practices. What I would hold up truly right now in this moment are more spiritual practices.
Yeah.
Um, One thing that I hope that we can move toward as a country, that we can hope to move toward as faith communities, we can move toward in smaller settings, um, is something called lament. And
Yeah.
you know, the Episcopal Church, as part of its liturgy, has the prayers of the people, and it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite parts of our liturgy. But there are other faith traditions, and in my growing up and historically Black faith tradition, um, lament is more than prayers of the people. Lament is it's a recognizing that you are suffering, and I'm going to suffer with you. I'm going to sit here in this pain with you, and we are going to go through it together. And I think we have lost that ability to, to truly deeply pray together and suffer together. We like to celebrate together,
Mm.
but there's so much work in building the relationships that you all have worked toward at 1 week. Is to trust people, to be vulnerable to people, to lean into the things that are uncomfortable because that's where we grow together. Um, and so I think that there are things that we have to acknowledge have been wrong and unhealthy and sad. And certainly in these last 7 or 8 months, that's been lifted up more than certainly any other time in my lifetime. Um, so how do we not just jump to, okay, we're done, everything's fine now, we're going to go back to business as usual? As George preached so beautifully on Easter, the new normal, it needs to be a new normal because the old normal wasn't working. Um, and I think part of getting to that new normal um, is acknowledging that we have really deeply been wounded.
Yeah.
Um, and how are we going to mourn that together? How are we going to acknowledge that together before we say, okay, now we can move forward together? Because otherwise, you're just papering over it.
That reminds me of Ruby Sales, the activist and public theologian.
Yeah,
Sort of one of her driving questions in her work is, where does it hurt? Where does it hurt?
yeah,
And creating space for that kind of vulnerability. I don't want to sentimentalize it because I think sometimes we have this tendency to assume that exploring what hurts has to be this thing that we expect from our closest friends and partners, right? But there's a public hurt that we don't know how to name and identify. And I like that you brought up the spiritual practices of public lament. Like, are there practices that allow us to hold that out in front of one another in a way that encourages bravery as opposed to just sort of us falling apart? We have a hard time being vulnerable that way because we don't have a lot of models, I think, in public life or airing our grievances in a way that they can be sustained and held and acknowledged for what they are,
right, right.
and I I wonder about that. I wonder about our resistance to, being able to be public about those things.
Yeah.
The other piece that I keep thinking about is, you know, um, past November 3rd, I think of the usual language we've used in the church is that we're citizens of two kingdoms, right? The earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom. And we're here, and then there's the not yet. And we don't want to confuse the two. We don't. I don't want to appeal to some sense of Christian nationalism. That's not what I'm about. I don't want to live into this image of what anyone's version of what it means to be Christian. But I do want us to appeal to our better senses as to how to build the kind of world we want to live in. And I think the example I get from Scripture isn't one of this is the way to be made whole. This is what the kingdom looks like. The example I get from Scripture, at least from the book of Acts, is that the way that you live into that is through this conflict and dialogue and tension and resolution and the continuous sort of tensions of people from different tribes, nations learning how to be together. Um, I think we look at the book of Acts on Pentecost, at least in our tradition. We really like that image of they shared all things in common, flaming tongues of fire, they spoke each other's languages. And we don't realize that come, like the third chapter, everything's falling apart. you know, there's tensions between the Jewish followers of Jesus and Greek followers of Jesus, even if they're Jewish. Then there's tensions with the Roman followers of Jesus. There's the Ethiopian eunuch. There's all this conflict happening around who's in and who's out. And guess what? The people who are supposed to be leading the pack are often the people who are getting it wrong. And I think for us to live into this world as it should be, it requires the humility of being able to hear the grievances and hear the hurt. And then from that, sort of ask, what kind of world do we want to build together? As opposed to, what kind of world do I think would be complete? Um,
Right. I want to hold up Ruby Sales again for
yeah,
anyone who's with us who is not familiar with Ruby Sales' story. There's even an Episcopal connection. Please, please Google her because um, there's so much there.
yeah,
Um, and then also hold up again the inherent messiness of this. Mess is not bad. It's not bad when something takes some time and it takes some sitting down and it takes the humility to say, I'm sorry, I never thought of it that way. Or, that's not been my experience. Help me to understand it. Um, we can become so walled off to things that are not in our purview or in our immediate situation. Um, and if we're going to be willing to suffer together, to feel to try to feel, to approximate what each other is going through, um, I think that opens up true paths to compassion and true paths to collaboration that cannot happen um, if we stay hardened and if we again want to go the quickest, most efficient way possible. So, um, democracy, it should be messy. I can pull back on my college time. Um, it to expect us to have achieved things um, a few hundred years in that involve this many humans, it's not going to be perfect. And again, let's love it through its imperfections. Let's help it recognize where it has failed, and let's work to improve those things. Um, let's not venerate it as if it's got it all together. And then let's not lose sight of our ability to affect it, to affect change, to vote. If you haven't, please do. to vote, but to engage through things like One Wake, to engage through things like the outreach ministries, to engage in higher, larger efforts um, to make us more whole, not perfect, but more whole. Um,
I think of it's an endless meeting,
it's an endless meeting.
but I think with that comes this sort of, and it is contemplating and admiring what is not yours, and it's this constant invitation to that curiosity necessary to explore another's person experience, like, and that again, I don't know if we were giving the skills to do that very well through sort of the way that these conversations happen in public forums. We don't have the time for it, or at least, the way that we have 24-hour news coverage doesn't allow the time for that to
Yeah.
simmer and to sort of, to breathe,
Right.
Um, I don't think we have very many opportunities for that. But something that you were saying just reminded me of the complicated nature of the things that hurt, and maybe another one of my sermons, which are related to exile, is of trying to redeem complicated feelings in the public square.
Yeah.
We we know what to do with anger, I and there is an anger that can turn violent. I'm not belittling or minimizing that. I should say I'm not trying to minimize the potential for violence that brings, but you know, anger finds its roots in a Norse word that means grief.
Yeah.
And that anger is usually about things gone awry, right? We feel angry when our expectations aren't met. And for some, they feel anger because they see the long history, they see the experiences that they've had. And the only reasonable response, again, if we treat anger as an emotion that just needs to be acknowledged as opposed to fixed, an emotion that we're just naming as opposed to figuring out how to act on it. But anger is often a grief about possibilities that have been denied.
Right.
We, we don't have the patience or the skill to listen to anger for what it is.
Right.
And we don't have the tools to explore it in a more productive way beyond that.
Right.
But even before we explore the productive ways, I like how you brought up the practices of lament as we just need to acknowledge them first. Even if before we get to how to address them, we need spaces to acknowledge. And that, makes me think of Jeremiah again, claiming to the people of Israel, uh, that have their nice rituals of worship and the city's falling apart and the widows and the orphans, nobody's caring for them. And he says, I detest, your rituals, people that proclaim peace, peace when there is no peace, people that say the peace of the Lord be with you when there is definitely not peace, um, and I think about that, about the ways that our nice rituals and our sort of general ways of relating don't create space for that question. Where does it hurt?
Hurt. Where does it hurt? Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
can I sit here with you? I don't know what to say. I don't know how to fix it. Can I sit here with you?
And will you go on this journey with me?
Mhm.
Don't stop at like yelling, No, I'll sit here long enough to listen past the yelling, and then will you explore it with me? Can I be invited into this process? Um, can we make space for one another in that regard? You know, hmm. I'm curious. So we've talked a little bit about disciplines already,
Mhm.
but and we've talked about disciplines to manage this political time, these conversations. You know, along partisan divides, I think, along all these different divides. But, I also find that I need habits that sustain me beyond the habits that I use to do these things. I'm kind of curious, what kind of disciplines, habits do you incorporate into your life in order to sort of feed and sustain you so that you can do this work well?
Right, right. Um, so one thing I do occasionally, um, not probably not as much as I need to, I'll do a news fast where I will, I live with people and I live with enough connections that if anything went horribly awry, someone would let me know. But I try to step away from Twitter. I try to step away from um, all of the different online places I'm usually checking on each day. I will not turn anything on the TV except for HGTV or the Cooking Network. I disengage as much as I can for maybe 24 hours, um, just to give myself a chance to center in a way that I can't be centered if I'm doing the thing where my brain is going 14 different directions and getting anxious in 14 different directions. Um, I go outside. We have been gifted with creation. We have a responsibility to creation. And regardless of how badly we treated creation, it still gives us so much, particularly in fall. Um, so outside with the dogs, um, I read,
Hmm.
um, and I try to enjoy the creativity of others, whatever form that takes. Um, my feeling is as long as people are creating, there's hope in this world. When the creatives stop, that's when I'm going to get afraid. That's when I'm going to be scared. Um, and that can be genuinely from reading poetry to watching the Great British Bake Off, because when people are doing wonderful things with meringue and fondant, it feels really, really good to me. Butter and cream. Um, so
Yeah, I think
it's
of
just these little things. Yeah.
there's a show, Somebody Feed Phil, which is similar to me. You know, it's just Phil Rosenthal traveling around the world, not a chef, not really a guy who knows much about this, eating really good food. It is
Yeah.
very soothing to me.
Very true. And so you're watching Phil. What else are you doing?
Yeah. um, I you talked about disciplines of hope. I often thinks about the discipline of joy
Mhm.
in everyday life, and that to me includes a lot of the things that you named. But I don't think we always think about that. We always think about what it means to sort of nurture joy within our lives, in order to do the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. I think humor. I think seeing the limitations of our efforts. I think laughing at ourselves is is a big part of being able to do this work well. So in terms of, you know, sort of living into that joy, I just think like, there are spaces where I can nurture that, and that for me is the friendships that I hold close. You know, like the people that I can laugh with. And it comes through being able to engage with this materials and finding ways that are productive to be funny even in the face of pain. Not to diminish the pain, but to be able to see the limitations of our efforts and to realize that we are fragile, limited creatures. You know that
Mhm.
we can't do everything. We can't change everything from the get-go. We can only do what we can. And so we might as well laugh at ourselves with that. And I think the main example I have for that, honestly, is my own father. He's just the kind of guy who um, has never known a stranger. And some of you may have met him at a certain point. And when we moved to the States, you can tell when someone moves to a new country sometimes by the level of accent that they retain, because the older you are, the harder it is to sort of so you can tell my accent is a lot less than my father's. And some folks have sometimes, like, it takes them a while to pick up on his accent, and my father is unfazed and will crack jokes even if that person is struggling to make sense of that, and he will laugh at himself.
Mm.
because his own jokes, because he thinks he's really funny, and I think so too. And I kind of see that example as something of he's not a person who has necessarily had an easy life,
Mhm.
and yet he's able to laugh with such joy that I I I see that as a model for me of the kind of life that I want to live. So we're oof, man, we covered a lot and we have about 7 minutes left, but I didn't want to I want to transition into a Q&A of sorts.
Mhm.
But I didn't want to leave without asking the last question. What are some books, stories, poems that you'd like to recommend to folks? Um,
I
uh,
have a stack, but I'm only going to show three. I'm only going to show one is The Impossible Will Take a Little While, Perseverance and Hope in Troubled Times, which is it's a collection of essays. If you've done Moms or anything like that with me, um, it's from 2004, 2006, and it's just remarkable. And they're short, and there are some I go back to and read time and time and time again because um, there are wise, wise people who have walked ahead of us. That's another piece of um, our conversation we didn't even get to was um, the people through history who've inspired us and who inspire us to keep going because what they dealt with and that we are here is testament to their hopefulness. So The Impossible will take a little while. New one I have just started is Rally by Brittany Winn Lee, Communal Prayers for Lovers of Jesus and Justice. And there's specifically a liturgy for hope that I was reading last night. Really wonderful, powerful stuff. And one that I've gotten, but I have not yet started, that George has held up, and that is Bishop Curry, Love is the Way. And just based on his other books, it's almost like I'm holding on to that one. I'm going to crack it with the emergency hammer when I really need it, because I am confident that it will be what I need when I need it.
yeah, I like that. I was thinking so I'm the priest in this conversation, so I was like I should name a theology book at least. But the first couple of books that came to mind weren't theology books, so I'll just name one that I think is really important for the conversations we're having these days, and that is James Cone, James the Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Tree, absolutely.
Deep catalog of monumental works in sort of Black liberation theology. But The Cross and the Lynching Tree is one of the last books he wrote before he passed. And it's one that I think about often now around how we talk about our faith and how we talk about suffering. And I think it's a great exploration of that draws in a lot of voices in the history of these conversations. So that's the first one that came to mind, and I think I left that one at home, so I was looking for it just now. But now I want to switch over to some fiction because
Okay.
that's where I get a lot of energy. And the one that I thought of first was also one that's been turned into a show with Ethan Hawke on it. It's The Good Lord Bird by James
By
McBride.
James McBride, yes, yes.
I, I love this book, exploring the history of, it's part fiction, part historical fiction, you might say, following the story of John Brown, of John Brown's Rebellion, with wit and humor, exploring a dark chapter in our history, and again, kind of nurturing that sense of if we're gonna look at this, we need to be able to find some way to access it, and humor is one of those ways we do it. And then another author that I really love is Louise Erdrich. Um, and the book I'd point to is The Last Report on the Miracles at Little No Horse. And this is about a priest on a Native American reservation over decades. And for me, what it does is it tells the story of what it means to be invested in a community and to admire and contemplate what isn't yours. This Catholic priest
Mhm.
learning to admire and contemplate the ways of life that are foreign to that person, you know. Um, so those are the two books that I thought of. Three. So James Bone,
James Cone.
Bride, and Louise Erdrich. All right. One of the questions we're getting, we've got 5 minutes left, so I just want to answer a couple of the things that were named here. There's questions about the books we're recommending, and I am happy to, once this conversation is posted, post some of the recommendations we had. So I'll collect them and make sure that they're linked once this conversation is posted. And now I'm gonna ask a couple of the questions that came in through our Q&A. So let me read it. After the election, we will still be a polarized nation with the vast majority of people publicly and loudly identifying with one side or the other. How do we close that divide without compromising on the personal values that led each of us to vote for the candidates we did?
Well, that's kind of hard.
Right?
Oh, so I'm going to offer a suggestion that's an incremental step,
Yeah.
because I think this will be an ongoing conversation. Graduate studies will be done on this. Think pieces and books will be done on this. So I think for me there are two pieces. One is, there is a quote by James Baldwin that some of you have heard me use before, and I'm going to paraphrase it, and that is, we can disagree and still love each other unless our disagreement is rooted in my oppression and the denial of my humanity. And so I think that there are people who, quite honestly, for whom it would be difficult for me to completely bridge a gap if the disagreement that is dividing us is the denial of someone's humanity. So I'm not trying to address that. That's my humanity showing itself. But one of the things I do, and I try to do, and I continually try to do, is to see the face of God in everyone, and to be reminded that everyone was someone's child. And so when I am talking with someone with whom I disagree, when I am really, really in the weeds on a conversation, I write an occasional commentary for the NNO, and I get emails from people who are not pleased with me. And the immediate visceral reaction is to give them exactly what they have just emailed me. And I have gotten into a practice, into a habit of reminding myself that person is a child of God. That person is some mother's child. I'm going to respond to them from that place, and not from the place of anger that they have written me. And so that is an incremental step, is recognizing, again, that humanity. I don't think that fixes anything quickly. I don't think it fixes all things. But I do think when we look at someone else and we see them as equally loved, it at least maybe takes away some of the sharpness and some of the immediate hostility.
I love that. Yeah, I think I'm resonating with that. And I just want to name, we're at 11:15. I think let's maybe go 5 minutes over, if that's okay with you, Aleta, since
Sure.
For those who want to remain, since there's a couple more questions. And the only thing I'd add to that in terms of how do we close that divide without compromising on our personal values, I find that most conversations I have with people that I disagree with are not usually the sum total of that person's identity. That I often, again, with that caveat of what you mentioned with the Baldwin quote, of the issues that pertain to the dignity and rights of an individual, any particular person. I find that people are just more complex and complicated than all of that. And most of the things that I need to do to live a life together don't require me delving into that every single time. And I wonder about those habits again of creating a common life outside of the partisan talking points that are given to us uh, by the ways these conversations happen. Usually, the starting point is you may not agree on a candidate, but you do agree that maybe there should be a stop sign on a street corner when near their school, right? Can we start there?
Mhm.
We start with the things we can collaborate on together and build from there. I think it's our tendency to want to fix a thing and to get to the resolution of an idea or an issue that sometimes gets in the ways of us being able to explore a thing, like the thing that we share in common. There is another question in the Q&A, and I think this is more for, it looks like aimed at a priest since it's asked,
Ain't it free?
know how many times in the New Testament Jesus gives examples of what the kingdom of God is like? How many different ways does he describe it? Could that give us hope that the kingdom is many things and can hold many ways? I think that's an interesting question. Uh, yeah, maybe aimed at a priest. I would say one of the things I would name there is the way that Jesus talks about the kingdom. If you look through the Gospels, it's in parables, and it's in, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. There are these images that ask the question, can you imagine with me what this looks like? And I think alongside the disciplines of hope and disciplines of joy, something that's missing that applies to the previous questions too is a discipline of curiosity. You know, I, I want to resolve this issue that seems to me to be the most important one. And this person just disagrees with me. I wonder why, or I wonder what we have in common. I can we approach this a different direction? That curiosity is, I think, a part of the source of images that Jesus gives us. The kingdom of God is like, you know, uh, uh, you know, uh, someone who hosted a great banquet feast. There's all these images in Scripture about that. So I would keep that in mind. All right, I think that is it for questions for today. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been here for this conversation. I just appreciate this time together. Thank you, Aleta, for being with us and for being a part of what I think will be an ongoing conversation past November 3rd and the work that we do together here. So thank you. And with that, go forth in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right.
Have a good Sunday.